Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. My name is Sebastian Moore.
And I'm hilary.salt.
And it's a very sad week because the World Cup is over.
I've been watching the Tour de France now, though.
Yeah, it's moved on. I think I was thinking this on Sunday. We had Tour de France, the Open, the Formula One, the World Cup final. It's too much sport. It's actually good when some of them fall away because then you can focus on just one or two things.
Okay. I confess I had no interest in the Open or Formula One.
No. At all. I've got so much paraphernalia for the World Cup and I'm really reluctant to take it down.
I do think you do need to at some point.
Really?
You've got to accept that it's over.
Yeah. Good tournament?
I thought so, yeah. I mean, I know we disagree on this, don't we? But I kind of feel that if you'd have offered us that before we started, we might have taken a semi-final. Good performance-ish.
Absolutely not.
No.
I loved the third place playoff. One of the most entertaining games I've ever seen. We had so much fun.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it just shows that we can play.
Yeah.
But I know we can play, as the Three Lions song goes.
As the song says, yeah. Didn't somebody say it was the game that nobody wanted to be in that turned into the game nobody wanted to end? That's quite clever.
Did you see Trump at the World Cup final?
At the presentation ceremony when they were trying to get rid of him?
I was texting my group of friends saying, is he going to leave the stage? Just wait and see what he did. Yeah. And he sort of wanders over and he's just standing next to them. Yeah. And then Infantino runs across to try and get rid of him.
Yeah.
So funny.
They're just trying to usher him out of the way, aren't they, politely?
Yeah.
Good. Anyway.
I thought it was an amazing tournament. I absolutely loved it. I think it's one that we'll look back on really with a lot of fondness, actually.
Yes. Where were the Euros?
The Euros are here.
Oh, are they here?
Yeah,
oh, right,
first England match.
Yeah.
And I think it's the first game of the tournament, is at the Etihad.
Oh, the council house. Right, okay.
One of my friends who wasn't into football before, she thinks she's a Man City fan.
Oh, dear.
I said, no, sorry.
No.
Can't be doing that.
Good. Well done.
Okay, onto politics.
Yeah,
big week. So I thought we'd focus on the new Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, we have some knowledge of being based here in Manchester, Greater Manchester, and he was mayor here for this region in, I think, for 9 years, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And we're in the midst of deciding a new mayor, which will be in 8 days' time from when we're recording this. We're going to a hustings on Monday.
We are.
Neither of us are participating, which I am really looking forward to, because normally hustings, when we're actually in the hustings, there's a lot of pressure to perform.
Yeah.
This one, I'm just going to be there with my popcorn, heckling, shouting questions. Should be good.
Yeah.
So I thought there was a couple of things, which is, firstly, let's just talk about Burnham as what we make of his first couple of days. Of him coming in. What does that mean for the political landscape? What does it mean for us? And then maybe you could then go on to talk about Manchesterism.
Yes, I want to talk a bit about what Manchesterism is. Is it any more than vibes?
Very good. So, Burnham became Prime Minister on Monday.
He did.
We are recording this on Wednesday, just about keeping track of days.
The world's not ended.
So he's been Prime Minister for 2 days. He gave a speech outside Downing Street with no lectern.
No, just a mic. He wants to be close to the people.
It's funny. I saw, I think it was a Spectator article that was sort of mocking him for that, saying, and Burnham gets a lot of criticism for the fact that I think people project it as him having thinly veiled difference in aesthetic compared to previous prime ministers. You know, he's like Starmer in jeans is what he's been accused of. And I think in some ways there's merit to that, but I also think it does actually make a difference, and these subtle things can have a difference in communicating what you're trying to communicate. And his message was very much, we're going to be different. We're not going to, and what did I say a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about what our advice would be for Mr. Burnham?
You said the first thing he should say is, we're drawing a line now, all this changing the Prime Minister all the time, we're going to stop all that.
Yeah, and that's what he said.
Pretty much.
He said he said we will make this moment a circuit breaker for Britain, bringing forward the biggest changes in the last 40 years. That's really bold.
It is.
He said a new political model and a new economic model. So these are high aspirations. Whether he will achieve them or not is a separate question. But it was an interesting first speech, just 6 minutes long, outside Downing Street with no lectern. He had all of his, I suppose, allies and family and people around. I thought it was really interesting how it's Josh Simons, isn't it, the MP that stepped down for him?
Yeah.
He was there.
With
very
his baby?
Casual clothes. Yeah. With his youngster.
Oh, right, okay.
And then Steve Rotherham, Mayor for Liverpool, or Liverpool
had the baby.
region, had his baby. But I thought it was interesting because Josh Simons is somebody that wasn't assumed to be a close ally of Burnham, but then stepped down to give him his seat. He's right there on Downing Street and celebrating with him. It's always strange, isn't it, a new changing of the guard, because it's a very celebratory and it's sort of quite weird how this was a government that was marred in scandal and just complete failure for the last few months, and now it's like, yay, we've got a new leader and it's all okay and everybody's cheering him on.
Yeah, I think my kind of vague worry is that this is the high point of his premiership, but let's try and be positive.
So I thought that first speech was really good. He said in the 1980s, Britain took some wrong turns. Political power was centralised, economic power privatised, large parts of the country deindustrialised. Almost sounds like a rap, doesn't it? But what he's doing there, and I think this is clear with Burnham, and we've covered him, for the last few months, but particularly knowing that he was going to inevitably end up as Prime Minister. He has a story, and his story is laid out in those, 3 lines there, that in the 1980s, we took a wrong turn. Notice not saying we need to go back to before the 1980s, as in we did things that we need to repeal, but instead we took a wrong turn and we could have gone this way. That's a really interesting idea, because I think there are a lot of people, this isn't a question of left or right, but a lot of people in the country that feel that was a turning point for that sort of managed decline that we talk about as a country. And we would say that in the SDP, a lot of things, key industries that were sold off. And that story of large parts of the country deindustrialised, he's connecting to those sort of red wall seats, those post-industrial areas, the maker fields.
The Makerfield test. We have the Makerfield test now.
Yeah, just elaborate on.
Well, does it serve the people of Makerfield? But broadly, I think it's the same as saying, is it in the national interest? To be honest, but.
Right. And this was, I think, somebody within Blue Labour was making this argument that it's a good job he won Makerfield rather than being allowed to stand in Gorton and Denton.
Correct.
Because Gorton and Denton would just be a completely different test, the Gorton and Denton test.
Oh, very different. Yes.
And Makerfield is actually probably a bit more representative of the country as a whole.
I agree. Definitely.
Yeah. So that is interesting. And then he said, I will soon issue my first instruction to end rough sleeping in this country. Now, that's interesting because that was what Jeremy Corbyn gave as a response when he was asked what his first words would be as Prime Minister. Now, he never got that opportunity. Burnham does have that opportunity. I mean, a lot of people will know if they're in Greater Manchester that was one of his pledges. And he actually did manage it during COVID, but there was a particular set of circumstances surrounding that time during COVID. And since then, it's homelessness and rough sleeping has got worse. The arguments on Burnham's side, I suppose, would be that it's a national issue and it is something that's hard to fix regionally, which I agree with, because if you're saying he had this program called ABEN, a bed every night. Now, if you're doing something like that, what do you do when people come from different regions and say, oh, brilliant, we can get a bed in Manchester? You're then trying to fix the whole homelessness problem in the UK just in one region.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he's got what he wanted. He's got the ability to do that now on a national level. And it's a pledge that is measurable and we can see whether he's actually going to achieve what he wants to do.
Interestingly, though, I don't think it's the thing that most people are worried about.
No?
I don't think most people think, what's the biggest problem in the UK? I don't think they think it's homelessness. They think it's the cost of living crisis, don't they? So it's odd that he started there.
Yeah, I wonder if, and I guess, rather than it being the central policy principle of his government, which he's kind of seemingly stating is the cost of living. He said, we're going to be the cost of living government, his words. I think instead of that, he's saying, we can't do any of that whilst people are, sleeping on the streets. And he's almost using that as a sort of a direction, or what would be the word for it? Like indicating to the country that we're not leaving people behind. We're not going to be doing all this other stuff whilst there are people sleeping on the streets. And I to be honest, and I remember when Corbyn said it, I was I felt very positive towards that, because I thought, yeah, that's the right approach. We shouldn't be having people sleeping on the streets.
Yeah.
And you've talked about this as when you have your guiding star project.
Yeah.
If you say something like that, you then go, well, what are the problems? And you start to look at cost of living, you start to look at housing, and you think, okay, it's not working, our current housing system. So we have to change that, we have to improve it. You also then start to look at things like immigration and the levels of immigration.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're, working from first principles and looking at it on the whole rather than being sort of ideologically driven. So I think it's a real positive thing to say.
Okay.
And my criticisms of Burnham does not lie in this speech.
Right. Okay.
I think that the speech is really good.
I did think that was the one point where, for me, I just went, whoa, I didn't expect that. At the ending, rough sleeping thing.
What did you think of his cabinet picks?
Interesting. I mean, there's no massive surprises, are there? I mean, I think John Healey as Chancellor, I think, is a bit of a... it's designed not to upset anybody.
Well, it was surprising for how boring it was.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there was nothing in there that I'd kind of gasped and thought, oh, I can't believe he's done that. So
Healey as Chancellor, Miliband as Foreign Secretary.
Yeah, which, I mean, that's what you do with people that you want to be out of your way and out from under your feet, don't you? You give them that post.
And I know we disagree on Ed Miliband, but I can't say I'm disappointed with that. The idea of Ed Miliband as Foreign Secretary, I think is perfectly fine. Like, go around the world and showcase Britain to the world. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, okay. At least he's not doing anything to upset things.
Yeah, get his hands off the levers of economic power. But yeah. Shabana Mahmood as Home Secretary.
Great that he's kept her. And I really hoped he would. I know there's a lot of discussion about her being potentially the Chancellor, but I do think the fact that she's making really big difference as Home Secretary, I think it's absolutely right that he leaves her there.
Yeah, and I think, I said this in last week's episode with Luke Gittos about the Manchester Council meeting that I'd attended, that the entertainment of the meeting was almost to its detriment, or to the detriment of the council, because the meetings probably should be a bit more boring and focused on the things that they can control. And in some ways, I always want to see a cabinet reshuffle because it's exciting and it's like, okay, what would it look like? Mahmood as Chancellor. But if a minister has been in position for a year or a couple of years, they'll have started to do things which, by keeping them in that role, they'll be able to see through.
Yeah.
And so it's probably a good idea. And I think we would both be in favour of longer ministerial reigns so that you can have a bit more stability within departments. What goes contrary to that, I suppose, is Streeting has been moved from health to defence.
Correct.
And we've got Yvette Cooper as health secretary.
Yeah, does she know anything about that? Is she? I don't know.
But then I don't know if you do need to know anything about these things. Okay. I don't know if that's the point. It probably should be the case, and I would like to see that. But I thought that was my first thought when John Healey became Chancellor. I thought, does he know anything about economics? And
he has served in the Treasury before.
He has, is he? Yeah. I presume he must
under
have
Gordon Brown.
Really?
Going back that far, yeah.
But yeah, maybe this is a little bit too innocent of me, but I just assumed that certain MPs would only be able to do certain departments because that's their speciality. where it feels like it's more sort of, oh, we have to find a job for so-and-so.
Yeah.
So we'll stick them in health or stick them in work and pensions. And
I think there's areas where it really does help. So, I mean, one of the people I was pleased to see the back of, who was obviously in the position because of his knowledge, was the Attorney General, Richard Hermer. He's gone. Although I don't think the person who's replaced now, I don't know enough about them to decide whether they're any good or not. But I was glad that he went.
Would there be a cabinet position that you would absolutely not want to do? Like, which ones would you just say, I can't possibly, I don't know anything about that?
So if I was waiting for the call from Andy and he was going to offer me something, and I would say, what would I say no to?
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. I think I would be scared to take on education.
Okay.
Just because I think it is very... Education means so many things, doesn't it? So it's right from people, kids joining in their first infant class, right up to, doctorates at degree level, and including skills and everything. It's a huge area where I think I would be quite worried about taking that on. And everybody in the area is a real expert, aren't they? So I'd worry about that a bit.
You know what that means is that in a future SDP government, when you get made Education Secretary, the press will be digging up this podcast and saying,
she said she didn't know anything about it. There you go. Don't offer me that then.
Okay.
When you're Prime Minister.
Okay. I'm trying to think which ones I wouldn't do. Women and Equalities Minister.
Oh, yeah.
I'd give it a go.
I mean, I think if I was PM, I'd get rid of that.
Would you?
Yeah.
Okay. Make them all women and education, women and defence, women, just every single one.
Well, just be sex blind.
Yeah.
Shouldn't matter, should it?
I agree. Okay, let's just wrap up talking about Andy Burnham's first couple of days by mentioning the policies he's announced already.
Yeah.
So what was really interesting about his sort of policy proposals is that he said that in the autumn he's going to bring forward a 10-year plan, and he said this in that 6-minute speech, which again is distancing himself as much as he can from previous politicians that have been accused of being very short-termist in their thinking. He has said that he's going to do things straight away, which he can do. Scrapping digital ID.
Hurrah.
Hurrah. And that will then enable him to spend that money, which wasn't even accounted for, to end VAT on energy bills.
Hurrah. Except in the north of Ireland.
Go on.
So I understand they can't do it in the north of Ireland because of the Windsor framework, which effectively extends European requirements to the north of Ireland still. And they don't allow you to change VAT. Well, they don't allow you to remove VAT.
And we can do it here.
Correct.
Because of Brexit. Brexit
Correct.
benefit.
A Brexit benefit.
There you go. He's also said today, I think, that they're going to implement £2 bus fare all over the country, which we already have in Manchester. Again, I think it's a really positive policy because it is positively affecting those people that take the buses, which are bound to be the poorer in society. So it's one of those sort of redistributive policies in a way.
Yeah, great. I fell foul of the £2 bus fare in Manchester last week because I've been taking buses because our trams, our Metrolink, they're suspended for 3 weeks while they do running repairs to the tracks. So the £2 bus fare in Manchester, I don't know if you know, it applies to if you take another journey within, I think it's 30 minutes, you can use the same ticket.
Yes, that's a recent development from the Mayor's office in the last 6 months.
But to do that, you have to get a ticket.
Ah, is that right?
And so before you tap your card, you have to say, please can I have a ticket? Because after you've tapped your card, they can't then go back and get it to give you a ticket. They have to know beforehand.
Oh, I thought
that
it
you
worked
want the
it
ticket.
out by just tapping. Okay.
No.
Just lastly then, who do you think are the winners and losers of Burnham becoming PM? I mean, people said that Reform were really happy for Starmer to stay as Prime Minister, because as long as he did, Reform were becoming more and more popular as an opposition to Starmer. Who do you think are the winners and losers?
Do you mean in a material way, or because I think there will be a kind of Burnham bounce, as it were?
I always mean politically.
Oh, right, okay. So politically, I think there will be a Burnham bounce. I think like the Labour Party will get an increase in support short term, particularly if he's doing quite popular things like bus fares and fuel. I actually think it probably will work against Reform, in that I almost think it will focus, because people are being focused back onto Labour. They'll almost implicitly be focused back onto Labour's traditional opposition, the Tories. So I think it might be good for the Tories. And I think it will be good for people who want to talk about political things rather than want to talk about who bought whose glasses, or, some of that, I don't know if you call it fraud, but some of that kind of underhand stuff that the previous administration engaged in.
I wonder what the first Burnham scandal will be.
He's got new shorts, I believe, after his previous shorts were pictured. Very short shorts.
Okay.
You remember them?
Too short.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about his philosophy, if he has one.
Yeah.
We've mentioned it before, but a great article in the Manchester Mill, which we can link to, about Burnham, and they were making the case that he doesn't really have much of a philosophy, and there's not really much to Burnhamism. A phrase that's been bandied around a lot recently is Manchesterism. I know you've got in front of you this paper, The Productive State, Framework for Manchesterism.
So, I wanted to talk about this, and I'm going to use it actually just to talk a bit, once we've looked at what we think Manchesterism is, at the specific case of Thames Water, which I think is quite an interesting one in the news at the moment. This being our news item, we should talk about the news a little bit, shouldn't we? So, what is Manchesterism? And I think there's a lot of vibes around it. And I think a lot of people who use the term haven't really thought much about what does it mean. But this paper, I think, is actually an interesting one and quite a compelling one. I don't necessarily agree with everything in it, but I think it's a very interesting read. And what they argue is that effectively the cost of living crisis, if we use that terminology, is really destabilising for everybody, because it makes people very focused on just getting through their life. And they say it's very difficult politically, because it also kind of undermines people's faith in the ability to vote for a political party that will then address their issues, because nobody seems to be able to do anything about anything. So they say, what do we do about that? What's the cause of that, and what do we do about it? And whilst they recognise that the cost of living crisis has lots of causes, like things like global instability and rising cost of oil, all those kind of things, they do point to the fact that a really big rationale and reason for it is the fact that the state no longer has control over essential services. Now, they tend to use words like control rather than ownership. So I don't think we're necessarily talking about old-fashioned nationalisation all the time. But they say that the fact that the state doesn't have control over essential services means that, because that's been put out to private companies to run, there's lots of reasons why that makes it more expensive. I'll talk about that in a minute. But they say that what that does is it causes what they call a fiscal escalator, which I think is quite hard to say, actually. I have to concentrate on saying it. Fiscal escalator, which means that as the cost of living goes up, that has an automatic impact on the level of benefits, because lots of benefits are linked to inflation. But also things like the rising cost of housing has a direct impact on housing benefit. So those things push up state costs, which means that ordinary people effectively pay twice. They pay once for the fact that housing is more expensive and Energy's more expensive. And then they pay again because the effect that those rising prices have on state expenditure means that taxation needs to go up. So they put that the argument in this Manchesterism thesis is that that's something that has to be addressed, that whole problem of private ownership of essential services. Now, a lot of people on the right would say, well, private ownership of essential services drives costs down because of competition, all those kinds of things. Why would they argue that it doesn't do that? So first of all, because actually in a lot of these areas, there's not really competition. So you might say you can shop around for your energy provider, but they're longish term contracts, aren't they? And not everybody can be bothered checking every 3 months what different providers' deals are. And, the state tries to create these kind of quasi-competitive processes within the provision of these services, but it's very cumbersome and clumsy, really. And if you look at things like tendering for the franchises on the rails, they're really long-term contracts. And the idea that there's day-to-day competition there, I think I don't think it's tenable, really, to argue that. So I think the argument that private sector works by lots of competition doesn't really work in a lot of these areas. And in fact, there's lots of reasons why it's actually more expensive to provide these services in the private sector. So if a private sector provider has to invest, they need to borrow money, and they'll always be charged more than government is charged for loans because there's a bigger default risk. So that makes things more expensive when it's provided in the private sector. There's also the fact that there's often a lack of vertical integration. So the obvious one is separating track and train. That, if you separate those two, you need lots of interface and lots of management of that relationship, and that increased costs. And also, if you look at privatisation, even on its own terms, as, you get the state out of those things, actually the state is massively involved in all these areas, because when you've got a private sector organisation providing things, you have to have a lot of regulation, not just of that business, but of the way that they interact with other businesses. And often, things crop up and then you have a bit more intervention, and then you have another regulator, and you have regulators operating in overlapping ways in a certain area. So, there's lots of government expenditure, even though it's meant to be privatised. And so for all those reasons, this thesis argues that we are paying way more for a lot of these essential services than we might do.
And they call it the privatisation premium.
That's right, yeah. And one of the numbers they have which will be relevant to the Thames Water discussion, is that 30% of your water bill covers the costs of debt in the water companies.
Debt that in some ways has been created whilst investors have been receiving dividends.
Partly that, but also partly just because debt costs more in the private sector because they have to pay higher charges. Scottish Water is perhaps a good example of how you compare it with. So Scottish Water is a private company, but it's wholly owned by the Scottish government, so there's no private involvement. So its debt is really guaranteed by the Scottish government, and their price includes about 10% to cover debt costs. So you can see that, arguably we're paying 20% too much for water because it's privately owned.
And when Scottish Water borrows money, are they borrowing at a rate that the Scottish government would be able to borrow?
Slight additional premium, but very small. Okay. Not the kind of...
and is that because Scottish Water could go bust and be liquidated?
Well, if Scottish Water did go bust, it would effectively... It's the Scottish government are the only equity holders. So effectively they would have to bail it out. They'd like to argue that they're not required to do that, but I think in reality it would be very difficult for them not to. It's very different in the private sector. And perhaps we'll come on to that when we talk about Thames Water, rather than getting distracted by that.
Can I ask about that then? So
yeah.
the paper, firstly, who wrote it? And secondly, what has that got to do with Manchesterism? And why? Because I'm sitting here thinking, okay, we're in Manchester right now. What is Manchesterism? Is it bright and shiny new skyscrapers ruining the culture of the city?
Yeah, okay. So who's it written by? It's written by an organisation within the Labour Party called Mainstream. So the guys who wrote it called Matthew Lawrence, Alex Williams. I think they both work for a think tank called Commonwealth, 2 words, Commonwealth. But Andy Burnham has used this term, the productive state, quite a lot. So I do think he is being guided by it. Now, you ask, what's got to do with Manchesterism? So this argument that you need the state to control more, this is very obvious what I'm going to say now, but a good example of that is the B network in Manchester. This is the public, it's not publicly owned. This is a transport system that is now publicly controlled. So effectively the mayor's office now control on all our buses, fares, timetables, all those kind of things, although those buses are still owned privately. Now, the two things we've not talked about in terms of what this Manchesterism analysis does are, first of all, whilst they say we need more state control, they do kind of apply tests to where that state control should be applied and where it shouldn't, because they're very keen to say they don't want the state to crowd out the market. And the other thing they say is that there's different ways in which the state could intervene. So one of the ways they could intervene, for example, is by being a purchaser and seller of goods. So, you buy, the state intervenes to kind of level out volatility in prices. One of the examples they use is there used to be a gas storage facility, which has disappeared now. And, if the government were to require or to control the requirement for some gas storage facility, that would mean it could, effectively intervene to level out prices. So it doesn't necessarily mean you own it. And so I think where you would argue this is Manchesterism is by saying in Manchester and the transport, the government, the mayor's office has not intervened to buy stuff back or to renationalise, but it has intervened to have more state control. And that, I think, is what they would argue is one of the tenets of Manchesterism. Can I say a bit about the test I think they should apply to say whether or not it's a good area for state control? So the tests they have are, first of all, a test of whether there's kind of what they call productivity exhaustion. So if you think about areas where the market works well, it tends to work well where it can improve productivity by innovation, for example, by introducing new technology, new processes. And, that's how competition works, because if you do that, then you can do things more cheaply than somebody else in the market. But there's lots of areas where actually the only way that a provider can drive down prices is by reducing pay or reducing quality. And perhaps the best example of that is care. So you can't really have a lot of productivity gains within the care sector because it's all about, looking after people. And so, if it's one of those areas, that's potentially one where it would be appropriate for there to be some state intervention. That's one example. Other examples they have are, for example, if it's an area where a change in the cost of something ripples through the whole of the economy. So I'd say energy is a good example of that, where if energy costs go up, it affects not just you or not just company A, but everybody within society. And it kind of becomes a systemic risk for society if the costs of that escalate. They also have a couple of perhaps wider political tests. One is, for example, where it's something where it's a kind of social good that, you're trying to provide. So housing perhaps might be something that falls into that as an example. And something where it's a kind of policy area. And to me, the best example of that is defence, where, you're just not going to get you're not going to get a private sector ability to run our defence spending for us. The other one that perhaps I haven't mentioned is just one where it's very difficult for the private sector to think long term. And, we talked a bit about that earlier, that, if you've got to invest long term, that's something it's harder for the private sector to do. Very much focused on quarterly earnings and profit levels and trying to prioritise, where you're going to be in 5 years is more difficult for the private sector. So, they do say that there should be tests where state intervention is sensible or not. And they also lay out different ways in which the state might intervene. So the idea of, mentioned already, whether you can level out volatility in prices, that's one. Another is where they say the state could act as a decommodifier. These are some of these terms you kind of think, well, what does that mean? So, for example, they say it's perfectly possible for us to address through general taxation the cost of an initial essential level of energy. So effectively, the energy providers, perhaps they're privately owned energy providers, would provide everybody with the kind of basic level of energy without anybody paying anything. That's effectively paid for through general taxation. And then you pay for what you want on top of that. So they say that might be an area where the state could intervene. And then, they also say there's an area where the state could intervene by directly producing. And an example of that would be if the state started to rebuild council houses and actually be the provider of those services. So different ways in which the state could intervene. So I think the kind of overarching theory, if we're trying to say what is Manchesterism, it's saying that there are sensible ways where the state can intervene, perhaps not by direct ownership, but by thinking about how do we provide essential services at affordable costs in a way that addresses the cost of living crisis.
It just seems to me that these things are have not really happened in Manchester. I mean, you've got the B network as a publicly controlled transport network. Do you think they've just attached the label Manchesterism to get the attention of Andy Burnham? Almost like a toy for a cat. They've sort of dangled it in front of him. Like, look, it's Manchester.
Well, it's branding. I'd say that's what it is. It's branding, really, isn't it? It's saying, because I don't think these suggestions are necessarily new. They're trying to codify them under giving it one label. But I'd say it's more branding than anything else. And obviously the fact that as soon as you think of Manchester, you're thinking of Andy Burnham at the moment. The fact that those two fit together, I think, is quite nice for them, in terms of how they're trying to sell both Andy Burnham and these political ideas. I think it's quite nice for them to fit together. But yeah, I think it is. There's definitely a lot of vibes, even though there is, I would argue, some level of analysis behind it.
Okay. And you wanted to talk about Thames Water?
I did want to talk about Thames Water, yeah, because I think this is perhaps an area where you might argue that state intervention is justified. So shall I give you a bit of a potted history of Thames Water? I don't know if you know the whole history. So water companies were privatised by Margaret Thatcher in 1989. I know you weren't around, so you won't remember. We had, because of the whole wave of privatisations at the time, and I think Thatcher really did honestly believe that we would end up with our utilities owned by thousands of ordinary shareholders who would receive a dividend from those companies, see them really thriving, and it would be a kind of win-win scenario. And there was a big advertising campaign, I think it was around British Gas actually, rather than the water companies, where it was, tell Sid that he can register for British Gas shares. And everybody was passing little notes, here's the phone number to ring to get your prospectus and things. You might be able to find one of those adverts on YouTube if you search hard enough. So, that idea that you would have a democracy of individual shareholders, I think was partly the dream of privatisation, but I don't think it ever really became that. So although thousands of people did buy shares individually, very soon those shares were bought by the institutional investors, the banks, pension funds, fund management companies. And then so that was 1989. In 2001, the whole organisation of Thames Water was purchased by RWE, which is a German utilities company, and it was effectively taken off the stock market. So they bought all the shares, they turned it into a private company. And that in and of itself, I think, is quite a problematic thing. Lots and lots of businesses are now owned privately, and that means that they don't meet the same transparency requirements as stock exchange listed companies. So that in and of itself is a problem. But that's what happened. So it was owned by the German utilities company for a while. And then it was sold to Macquarie. Now, Macquarie are, do you know who they are? So they're an Australian kind of, they're quite often called a bank, but I think they're kind of a kind of financial conglomerate, really. And what they did was they bought the company, and I think they bought it for something like 5.1 billion. But of that, 2.8 billion was debt that Macquarie took on in order to have the money to buy the business from RWE. Now, the other part of the money came from the investors who were invested in Macquarie's, I think it was called the European Infrastructure Fund. So different fund managers would put their money with Macquarie. Macquarie would pool all that money together and use it to buy Thames Water. So they bought Thames Water, and after the purchase of the business, they, I think in 2 tranches, took out £2 billion worth of debt, which they effectively used to repay the debt that Macquarie had taken out to purchase the company. So in other words, they transferred that debt from Macquarie into the Thames Water business. Now, that was despite the fact that Ofwat at the time had said that the regulated body, Thames Water, the company, would be the debt would be ring-fenced away from Thames Water. And it turned out that the debt wouldn't be ring-fenced from a subsidiary of Thames Water registered in the Cayman Islands that the business set up after the sale to Macquarie. And that's where the debt effectively was taken out. So Macquarie's ownership, I think you would say, was a bit of a litany of disaster. They would deny this, but the judge who sat in a case taken by the Environment Agency accused them of massive underinvestment, diabolical management, and it led to, a number of cases where they heavily polluted the Thames and other rivers. So there was regulatory intervention because of all that. So, needless to say, during this time, the Thames Water business was paying very significant dividends to those owners of the business, the owners of the business being the owners of the Macquarie European Infrastructure Fund. So, fund management companies, pension schemes, all those kind of people. So, I think if you wanted to point the finger at where it all went wrong, I would say that happened during the Macquarie ownership period, because that is where, things were, I think, at their worst. I think it was 2012 to 2014 where they had the big discharges of pollution. So Macquarie then sold on the business. I think we're now in around 2017, to a group of owners, which included the Canadian pension schemes and some UK pension schemes, including the Universities Superannuation Scheme. That's the pension scheme that looks after the pensions of the academics in the universities. And I think it's fair to say they probably didn't really understand the scale of the problems. And whilst they tried to put things back on the right track, they really weren't able to do that. So it was during that time that the company effectively became insolvent. And I think USS lost about £600 million because their investment in it became worthless effectively. So what happened then was that the company was effectively put into the hands of the people who had lent the company money. So as well as the equity shareholders, the people who owned the equity in the business, there was further debt in the business, and that was owned by, people like Silver Point. They're one of the big US hedge funds, those kind of organisations. But also some people like M&G, that's the UK fund manager. They also owned some of that debt. So they have been running the organisation since, I think, about 2023. And it's staggering on. I think it would be the best way to describe what's happening. It's really struggling, and it's kind of one of the first things on the agenda for our new Prime Minister is to decide what to do. So our understanding is that what he would like to do is to effectively put this organisation into a effectively insolvency. It's a special administration regime, a SAR is the technical terminology for that. But to do that, he would have to prove that the company was insolvent, or it would have to fail on its regulatory promises. So it's not.
Is that a bit like the train operating companies, where it becomes the operator of last resort or something?
Yes, yeah. So I think in Railtrack, when Railtrack kind of fell over and became insolvent, the government effectively had to take it over, and that was through a special administration regime.
Northern Rail, TransPennine.
With the franchises.
The franchises, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think it's quite the same as that, because I think effectively in those circumstances, the franchise owners effectively said, we can't do it anymore, and almost handed it over. Whereas I think the situation now is much more tricky. So all those, I think there's about over 100 creditors of Thames Water. It's not just one or two organisations you're dealing with. You're dealing with this huge list of characters of people who've lent the organisation money. And whilst those, you might say, well, the business is insolvent, it's not worth anything. You've lost all your money.
Yeah.
The reality will be that those creditors will have taken charges over the assets of Thames Water. They wouldn't have lent that money without saying, well, what happens if you go insolvent? What do we get?
Bit like a mortgage, the way that the bank repossesses the home.
Exactly. I was exactly going to say that. So if you imagine an office building, if Thames Water become insolvent, then the creditor says, well, that building's now ours.
Yeah.
So, that means that it's very difficult for government to say, well, we're taking over because you're insolvent, because then the creditors will say, well, you're not having that building.
Yeah.
And you're not having that reservoir.
But what are the assets? The pipes? The reservoirs?
The reservoirs, the pipes, the buildings, yeah.
And the government can't really say, okay, well, yeah, you can take the pipes.
Absolutely. So it's actually really, because I think what will end up happening is there'll be a massive legal wrangle.
And will the government just take on the debt?
Well, that's part of the legal wrangle, I think. So, if the special administration regime would say, and to get a special administration regime, you have to go through 3 months consultation, and it has to be signed off by the High Court. And part of that special administration regime will be deciding who's going to get what. Now, it might be that you would say, well, you've got £1 billion worth of debt that you've lent the business. We'll give you 800 million of government stock to replace it. So they lose the 200 million. on the basis that that's the best deal they can get. They call that a haircut. They take a haircut of 200 million. Now, all that wrangling is just a case of, good old-fashioned red in tooth and claw negotiation. But they will play very hard ball. And the real difficulty for government is that there is a rescue plan on the table. So a conglomerate of different lenders, including some of the existing ones, have proposed a bailout, which involves them putting more debt into the business, putting some equity into the business and writing some debt off.
And the government turned it down, didn't they?
Well, I think that's the problem at the moment. We're all in limbo, really, because and if they just say no to that, effectively the company's teetering on the brink of insolvency.
And part of that agreement, I think, is that the there would be less regulation on a lot of the the sewage spills and stuff.
Yeah.
Because, and this is the arguments made in the productive state about the fact that if you want to encourage private investment, you have to take a hit on the regulation. Otherwise, if you overregulate too much, private capital is just going to say, no, okay, we're not going to get involved in this.
Yeah.
And so there is that balance.
Yeah. So part of the deal is definitely that they would want some of the penalty regime turned off for a period.
These are the fines that are issued towards water companies if there's sewage leaks.
Correct, yeah. Or if they fail to provide services as well, not just sewage. So it's a really tricky situation for the...
What would Margaret think?
Margaret Thatcher?
Yeah.
I think she'd be disappointed. I mean, I think she really did have in her head this dream of there would be thousands of ordinary working people, in the same way that she thought there's ordinary working people who own their council house. There'd be ordinary working people who had their little portfolio of shares and they'd have £200 in Thames Water and they might get £5 a year income from that. And I think that's what she thought privatisation would mean. Maybe I'm being very romantic and thinking that's what she thought, but I kind of think that she thought that is what would... But that's what would come out of privatisation. And certainly that's how they sold it to us. Maybe I'm just, very naive.
For us to move forward as a country, do you think there needs to be a consensus around the fact that Thatcher's kind of been proved wrong on a few of these things?
Absolutely. I think not every single privatisation was a failure, but I think the idea that you privatise these essential services, I think, was taking the wrong turning, as the Prime Minister said. And actually it's far more privatised than other countries. The UK, it's very different, certainly in water. Other countries have not gone down the route that we've gone down. So I think it is a mistake. And I think the idea of taking back control, if you want to put it that way, of our water needs to happen. I think it's tricky to find ways to do it, but that's certainly what I would be arguing for.
Okay. Anything else in Thames Water?
I think that is about all I have to say. And perhaps the other thing just to mention is that everybody looks at Thames Water as being the big outlier, and I think that's fair to say. But there are other water companies who've got problems as well. South East Water is really struggling, and one of the things the government's going to have to be thinking about is, am I setting a precedent here for other water companies? So that's the other thing that they need to be to have in the back of their minds. So a nice little conundrum for our new Prime Minister to deal with. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's end there, shall we? Because it's been a deeper dive than I was expecting.
A deeper dive into water.
Into water.
Yeah, well
I was
done.
thinking, are there any puns here? I didn't even notice that one. Good. All right, well, thanks for listening, everybody. And as always, if you've got any questions, feel free to drop a comment down below.
Indeed.
Or send us an email. Our email addresses, as always, are in the description. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks for listening.